And so, of course, they don't hear verses 22 and following. They just say, Gentiles, there we are. That proves the point. We knew you were disloyal. We're not listening to the actual arguments. And so the centurion wants to flog Paul, because that's how they tried to beat the truth out of somebody. He's tying him up for the rack, and then Paul plays the card again. Excuse me, Roman citizen, flogging without trial, not a good idea. Tribune is afraid. We've had this theme before in Philippi, and so he lets Paul go, and he brings them before the council. And then we get this wonderful scene in 23, which really rounds off this first statement of the charge and the defense, where there's this to and fro at the beginning of 23 between Paul and the high priest. And you've got to realize that as all these high priestly class, they swap the high priesthood around from year to year. Paul hasn't been in Jerusalem for a while. He doesn't know which of these esteemed gentlemen he's facing is actually the high priest. But Ananias commands those standing near him to strike him on the mouth when he says he's lived with a clear conscience. The appeal of the conscience is very important throughout this whole sequence. And Paul says, verse 3, God will strike you, you whitewashed wall. You're sitting there to judge me according to the law, yet in violation of the law you order me to be struck. And they say, you can't say that to the high priest. And Paul says, I didn't know he was the high priest. Scripture does say you must not speak evil of the ruler of your people. That's a fascinating little exchange. Paul is once again holding the rulers to account according to what they ought to be doing. And when it's pointed out that he's used rather abusive language to the high priest, he apologizes. He did not intend to break that scriptural command. It was an unintentional sin, and as a good Jew, he knows perfectly well that when you didn't intend it, you say sorry and you are covered. And that little negotiation there has a huge amount to teach us about holding up a mirror to those in power. It's part of the church's task. He did it in Philippi, now he's doing it in Jerusalem. But the key thing is the resurrection. Verse 6, I'm on trial concerning the hope of the resurrection of the dead. And so the Pharisees and the Sadducees fall over each other to argue about it, and Paul knows exactly what he's done, having released that cat among those pigeons. This hearing isn't going anywhere. And so we come to the end of the first cycle of charge and defense. And then we move into the second one. There's this wonderful, don't you love the plot to kill Paul? This bunch of people who band together and swear a solemn oath that they will neither eat nor drink until they'd killed Paul. And of course we all want to know, did they all starve to death? And I think the answer is no, they didn't. And being legal experts, they probably found all kinds of nice loopholes to persuade themselves that actually this didn't really count because thus and so and this and that. I write about that in Acts for Everyone. And the plot comes to light, and Paul is rescued, and it's an interesting sub-theme all the way through, the way in which actually the Romans end up rescuing Paul from the Jewish mob or from the high priests or whoever. And so the second sequence goes through in 24, where Paul is presented with the charges against him, and this time in front of Felix answers them. And this time he develops it a bit further by emphasizing in more detail, it's all about the resurrection. Verse 14 of chapter 24 is the key thing. Yes, I do admit this, that according to the way which they call a sect, I worship the God of our ancestors. I'm not worshiping a different God. I am being deeply loyal, and the God of our ancestors always was about the law and the prophets, which pointed, verse 15, to the resurrection here of both the righteous and the unrighteous. Therefore, once again, I do my best always to have a clear conscience towards God and all people. The promise of the resurrection, that's what we're going for. That is the ancient Jewish hope, according to Paul. He knows that's controversial, but that's where he's standing. And on that basis, I am not beholden to what this or that group may be trying to do by way of putting pressure on me. My conscience must be clear before the God who is the God of our ancestors and the one whom I worship. And so, again, he says, let them bring their charges. Let them prove that I was polluting the temple, which I wasn't. Let them prove that I'm a disloyal Jew, which I'm not. Let them show it. And in fact, they will see that what I have been up to is deep loyalty to the traditions of my fathers. And so Felix gets frightened. There's another lovely passage there, 24-25, as he discussed justice, self-control, and the coming judgment. Felix got worried. Well, he would, wouldn't he? Any typical Roman provincial governor had a thing called justice which he administered, but of course it always served the interests of Roman power. Self-control, Romans tended not to do that very much, shall we say, and the coming judgment, that was something they were very happy to ignore. Exactly, you see, as at the end of Acts 17, God has fixed a day on which he will judge the world by a man whom he's appointed. The resurrection is the coping stone in the theology whose twin pillars are creation and judgment. Judgment in that positive sense of the Creator God putting the world to rights. The point about the resurrection is that God has begun to do that. The resurrection of Jesus is the moment when the living God sets the world right. In principle. And all that now has to happen is that what happened on Easter Day has to be worked out through the whole cosmos. And this is just going to blow Felix's worldview apart. So he gets frightened, sends Paul away, hoping that Paul will bribe him and get round him that way. But Paul's not about to do that, of course. And so then Felix is replaced by Festus, who is a pain in the neck, but that's a whole other story. We won't go there today. And this time, again, we get Festus wants to do the Jews a favor. So he says, well, Paul, wouldn't you like to go to Jerusalem and have a hearing there or whatever? And again, verse 8, Paul says, look, I haven't committed an offense against the law of the Jews or against the temple, and this time, or against the emperor, verse 8. And Paul appeals to Caesar, verse 11, I appeal to Caesar. You have appealed to Caesar you will go.